Welcome to the DevLaunch podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of the tech industry's rising stars. Most of us rise the ranks of the corporate world, gaining expertise within an organization before launching out on our own. Tomé, on the other hand, did quite the opposite. After nearly a decade of entrepreneurial endeavors, he made the calculated decision to work as an employee for the first time in his career. Let's listen to how entrepreneurship shaped his life as an employee and ultimately what drove him back into owning his own business. Tomé, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I think something I'm really excited about to hear from you is your experience, not necessarily being from the USA or Canada, which all the rest of our guests previously have been from. You hail from the wonderful country of Portugal. And so while your story is not necessarily coming through the ranks of corporate America, it still is, there's still involved quite a large degree of entrepreneurial experience in your story. So would you mind sharing a little bit more about what has led us to the point where you are today with Penguin Objective?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the invite, first and foremost. It's, I guess, in a way, all my life I've been around entrepreneurship. I grew up in a house where one of my parents had their own business. So I grew up around that dynamic in a completely different kind of thing. By the time I was a teenager, I was self-taught in programming because one of my friends picked up a tutorial for C programming at the time. I picked it up and was like, oh, this is cool. And so I just kind of started that journey on my own, just learning how to program and then getting to networks and security and stuff like that. And eventually got to the age of, okay, I need to go to college or not. What do I do? My parents really wanted me to go to college. So I was like, it makes sense. It will set me up in a different way for life. So might as well do this. But I was a little bit bored, I should say, because a lot of the early stuff of the degree I had already picked up on my own by force of nature over the previous years. And so by my second year, I was starting my first business, which lasted for almost 10 years. By my fourth year in college, I was starting the second one, which failed miserably after a few months. And then then a few things happened in my life. So I ended up moving to Brazil for a year, coming back. I enrolled in a second degree. Long story short, by the time I left college, I had two companies running. So the first and the third. Second one had failed. Everything was going well, but about 2 years in, I kind of hit a ceiling into how much I was developing myself. And I said, you know what, time to pull back. So I closed everything down, moved countries again, this time to Ireland, to Dublin, joined Web Summit, fastest, super high growth startup. I usually joke that 1 year there was like 3 years of experience. And I stayed with them for about 5 years, then moved into a different startup for about a year, and then got back on my own and said, okay, now this is what I'm doing, and building this fractional practice is what I'm doing now.
I love it. So hopefully it's not too much of a painful story to rehash, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the second business, the one that failed. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about, was it like very similar to the first business? Was it a totally different thing?
Oh, no.
And what happened?
Very different businesses. So the first one started as game servers hosting for Counter-Strike and stuff like that, pivoted into web hosting, and then eventually started my web development kind of path. Second one was a crowdfunding platform. And third one was a web and DevOps boutique agency. So second one was basically when Kickstarter was getting momentum in the US. There was nothing in the European market. And myself and a couple of co-founders said, you know what, this could be a great thing to do here. We wanted to add a whole validate the project, validate the idea. The pains that eventually started coming out of Kickstarter of projects being funded that had no follow-up. We could see that as a risk, and we wanted to build a whole thing about that. Basically broke down out of three things. We were not experienced enough at all in terms of building a business. Second, we spent half of the pitch having to explain what crowdfunding was because it wasn't a well-known term yet. So it was way too early to do it. And then I think we did some mistakes in terms of execution that led to basically after a few months, it didn't make sense to continue and it just naturally fell apart. No harm done. Like we're all still friends. It wasn't really oh my God, this was a disaster. But it was definitely a very big learning experience for us in terms of like things that can go wrong. We even had an investor interested, and then that failed off, and he hired one of us. So it was kind of a very interesting experience, but the kind of thing that only happens with like really innocent 20-something-year-olds going, you know what, I can change the world. Let's do this.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the story behind that.
Interesting. Well, and the second point you made, the kind of a light bulb that went off for me when you just said that, which was basically that you had to spend so much time educating the market because it was still a relatively immature market. You know, now we talk about crowdfunding and like everybody knows pretty much everybody understands what crowdfunding is. But back in that day, that wasn't something that was readily available. People couldn't point to like, oh, that company does that. And so there's a lot of education that was required. And I think that's something that we can often overlook, especially in the tech space is, could this tech product revolutionize people's lives? Absolutely. But if you're so early, you know, unless you are really well equipped to educate the market and you know how to do that well, or you do that well, man, you're going to be up against so many, you know, so much pushback.
Yeah, and I think there's two parts to that. One is this was 2011. Okay, so this was really, really early days for crowdfunding, even in the US. The European market just hadn't seen anything like it. And so at least in the circles we moved, there was no knowledge of what it was. So we had to explain a whole different funding ecosystem to people that were only used to traditional, you know, equity funding that works a certain way. And so it was a very, very foreign. The second part of that is like marketing 101, right? Like you need to use your customers' pains, your customers' words, their phrasing. You need to be able, you're not explaining your solution. You're explaining, hey, here's how this is a pill for your pain. That is something that you learn with time, I think. So I'm much better at educating now than I was then. But I distinctly remember doing like those 90-second pitches and timing while practicing and going, I'm spending more than half just explaining what crowdfunding is. I need to cut this down. So, but invariably, most of the questions we would get would be about that and not our actual differentiating. So it was just a silly kind of situation to be in.
What was it called? I'm curious.
Dreamt by Me. I love the name, actually. I don't even have it publicly, like on my LinkedIn anymore or anything, I think. But it was like we had a beautiful landing page and all of that. It was just wrong team, wrong timing, maybe wrong geography, I think. Because there was a competitor that, or at least part of the founding team was also Portuguese, but they started in London, and that still exists today. Like they blew up and they became very big. So, you know, execution key, as always.
Yeah, that is huge. And, you know, you touched on this a little bit, but I'd love for you to share with us, especially with those, you said you had 3 ventures before launching your 4th being Penguin Objective, right?
Yeah.
Or did I get the number? Okay.
Correct.
So fourth one, Penguin Objective, the one we're talking about today. So 3 businesses. First one, the hosting, the game server hosting. Second one, the crowdfunding. Third one was the web and DevOps consultancy. So you had a lot of really, really good experiences, a lot of great entrepreneurial experiences. And you already touched a little bit on the marketing aspect for the crowdfunding platform. But would you mind sharing a little bit more about some of the things that you learned from a sales and marketing perspective on those first 3 businesses?
Painfully learned, I think is the word. But very, very good experience. So maybe the best is on the first. I'll touch on the first and the third because obviously longer allows for better lessons. At one point with the first one, so it was me and a co-founder. It was just 2 of us. And we said, you know what? Let's really see if we can make something out of this. And I remember we took shifts like 8 hours plus 8 hours, and we're basically like complementing each other with very little overlap. So we were online doing like customer support, sales, in contact with people, basically 14 to 16 hours a day, more than anyone else in the market was. Um, and we were basically online at all times, continuously engaging with potential customers. So we were like, and I'm not proud of this, but like we were, this was back in the days of IRC. So like really old chat systems. And we were like spamming channels and all of that, but basically engaging with, and all the potential customers where they were chatting. And like we saw literally the results of all that effort like that. Within a week, we started seeing an
Wow.
uptick. And by the end of 1 month, it was really a question of, is it sustainable to do this, or do we need to find a new strategy? But it was absolutely proof, like real proof, that it's a numbers game at the end of the day. Like if you have a valid
Mm-hmm.
proposition, in that case, we didn't have a differentiator from the rest of the market. The products were pretty much all the same across competitors. So it was really a matter of, are you quick enough to respond? Are you available? And it was a customer service, not in the sense of super quality service, but in the sense of being there when they needed it. That was the only differentiating point between companies. And so it really proved that for an engineer, and I'm sociable, but I am still, I still have an engineer profile. That was a major lesson for me in terms of how to actually do sales and how to negotiate and all of that. And then I think the other big lesson would be on the third one. That's when I started moving in terms of international projects. I think a little bit by chance, a little bit by design. Like we had one of our co-founders that was, he's Portuguese, but he wasn't living in Portugal at the time. And he moved around 3 countries throughout that period, throughout like, I think a year and a half. And basically anywhere he went, we would end up getting leads. And from there, we got clients. And that's when we started moving in terms of working internationally, English by default, et cetera, which created a completely different dynamic for the group. But like at one point, we had Australia and Portugal at the same time working. So 8 o'clock my time would be 8 a.m. would be 8 p.m. his time. So remote work, et cetera, which nowadays is a big thing. For us was just, yeah, sure. Like if he's living in a different country, we're still the same people. That's fine. We can still work. And I think the biggest lesson for me there was that it's really about reach. Like if you can get, if you can get a contact in Chile, sure, you can do business in Chile. You're going to have to understand the culture. You're going to have to understand a lot of nuance around it. But if you're really committed to, no, I want to do business in that particular country, just go after it. Like it works. And I mean, even today, for me, this is proof. Like my clients are spread between Canada, US, and Ireland. Like I don't live in any of those countries. I've lived in Ireland before, but still. And that is a design decision by me that I wanted to work with those countries because I like the cultures. I really like the way business moves. And so that I think was the biggest lesson for me. Marketing wise, I think I still have a lot to learn. So I'll leave that aside.
To be fair though, I think every good marketer, every good entrepreneur feels that. Like there's always so much more for us to develop on our sales and our marketing abilities and how we actually execute on it. So I think that's pretty normal. I want to go back to something you had said though, in the things that you'd been learning about marketing from your first business. You talked about going to your ideal client where they were, and it sounded like in like chat rooms. Did I get that right?
Yeah, correct.
Interesting. So what chat rooms were you circling around? Like where were they?
Okay, so this was the beginning of the business. Then eventually we pivoted into web hosting. So this is a very particular, like 3, maybe 6 months right at the beginning of the business. but majority of the clients would be teams that played professional Counter-Strike or Call of Duty or whatever, which is a big community and even more so nowadays. And all they were looking for really was a private server where they could practice or where they could have tournament games that included a referee and sometimes HLTV, which is streaming of that, and a few other things like voice comms, etc. And so all of them were really, at least in Portugal, were within the same community, which was a bunch of IRC channels around the tournaments, around the major, like the top 5 teams or top 3 teams, and then just general channels where they would mix and match for practice games. So everybody was in the same places. You really just had to go there. So our competitors were also there and were also doing the same thing. And that's why I said the response time, I think, was the key thing that turned around.
Well, especially when you have a relatively commoditized service or product, it's like, what really is differentiating you? And, maybe even an argument could be made in the software development space is it's like, especially with the global workforce being able to do software development and the rise of AI, essentially commoditizing much of the software development. It's like, what is it that's going to be different about you? And in your experience with that first company you worked with, really the differentiator was like how responsive and how engaged you were going to be with people when server went down or when they had questions about why something wasn't working or something like that.
And even at the earlier stage, when they were looking at options, because they would have questions, and the simple fact that we were there to reply to them instead of, you have to go to the website and look at that in human to human interaction was immediately different. But I think it applies across like so many things. Even yesterday I got, so I was at an event recently and I got a follow-up email from someone that was there trying to pitch me their outsourcing, staffing, all of that, right? I think all of us receive at least a few of those a day.
Multiple times a day.
And I found it interesting that like the reason I discarded it was because it was too formal. It's not the way I work. Like the language in the email was too formal. I knew that wouldn't click for me. I knew that it would be a difficult barrier in communication. Even last week, I was talking to somebody about this because they were trying to hire developers across from South America. And one of the tips I gave them was like, look at, in the first interactions, like look at potential barriers, whether it's the way they use language, whether it's, they prefer voice messages versus text, or they, are they better at email or instant messaging? Like look at what your style is and what you're going to click with, because that's going to make such a world of difference when you're working remote. And like I've worked remote basically all my life except 3 years where I was in Dublin in an office. And so a lot of these things, I think you learn with time, but it does make a fundamental difference to look at your communication style and who you can effectively collaborate remotely, and who, if you make an effort, you can get there, but it's harder and they prefer face-to-face or they prefer remote but synchronous, which is a whole different topic. So I think some of these aspects kind of apply across the board.
I love that. That's really good. And arguably, that's just not the type of learning you're going to have in a formal 4-year degree program. Like you're going to learn that because you're forced to just figure it out. And the reason why I love entrepreneurship so much is because like you learn these things, right?
Yeah, it's being knowledge driven at the end of the day, right? It's knowing that there's millions of ways to live in this planet for the 70, 90 years that we're here. But the Earth is going to keep spinning after we're gone, and like you can only learn as much as you force yourself not just to interact, but to try and connect with the other ways of life, and kind of try and figure out, maybe I don't want to do this, but something led this person to decide this way. I wonder what, like trying to really understand where people are coming from. I think it's an important thing.
That's great. I love that. So, in your story leading up to Penguin Objective, one of the things you talked about was that you realized at a certain point, I think during your third business, you realized that you would kind of hit a ceiling. You'd hit this place. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about like what was that ceiling, and also like why did you know that it was the right time to leave to then go and become an employee, right? Because like most of the stories we hear is people start off as employees, they do the learning, and then
Yeah.
they go and they start an entrepreneurial journey. But for you, it was like you're an entrepreneur first and foremost, and then you decided, hey, I want to go back to be an employee for a hot minute. So talk us through a little bit about your thought process there.
Uh, yeah, I expect you probably see this the other way around. So for me, it was actually the first time I became an employee after 10 years of having my own businesses. So
Wow.
it was even, and moving countries to do so. So it was a
Hmm.
fundamental life changing kind of,
Yeah.
I think it came down to two parts. I, so personal and business. My life had gone through a number of changes on the personal side. And so I was at a stage over like the previous 2, 3 years. So I was at a stage where I was ready to kind of reinvent myself and figure out, okay, what is the next stage of my life?
Hmm.
And on the business side, I was stable and I was honestly like working 20, maybe 30-hour weeks if it was a difficult week. And I was perfectly comfortable because I was only working with remote clients. So rates were completely different than local rates. So between that and cost of
Yeah.
life, like I could manage fine like that. And then it comes into data. I do a yearly review every year where I go through everything that happened. And I realized that I learned one new thing across all the projects the previous 14 months.
Wow.
It was even more than 12 months.
Hmm.
And I looked at that and I'm very knowledge driven. Like I like to be challenged, learn, and like keeps me going. And so I looked at that and I was like, hey, I've done the same thing for all this time. It was an API, a small web app, maybe, connecting to a mobile
Hmm.
app and infra automation. That's kind of the plates that I was spinning. And it was
Hmm.
completely different niches, completely different verticals, all of that. But in terms of deliverables, they still mapped out into the same things. And so I basically had two choices. Okay, either I'm going to figure out how to grow this business into a completely different thing so I can grab different kinds of projects and build that up, or I can basically just either keep this going or stop this one and focus on something else. I still had the first one running, so that was also an option. Should I scale that? That was on autopilot at that stage. And so the decision ended up for me being, okay, do I have the skill sets? What do I want to do later on? And
Hmm.
what can I do now to develop that skill set? And
Hmm.
I got to a point where I realized that probably, and this turned out not to be true, but at least it helped me make the decision, probably my next business, I would want to raise money. And so I looked at it from the
Hmm.
perspective of, do I have the credentials to raise money? And I
Hmm.
figured,
Hmm.
no, I don't, because all the businesses I've had have all been of a certain dimension, a certain scale. We didn't really have like lots of, I had never had 50 employees under my company, like building out. So literally made a list, a checklist of here's the skill sets that I need to develop. And more importantly than develop, actually get proof that I can do it outside of my own realm.
Hmm.
And then it was a matter of figuring out where to do that. And I ended up identifying Web Summit as one company that I connected with the culture, that I
Hmm.
high growth, like it ticked all the boxes for me. And
Hmm.
luckily, it was a good assessment because I was there for 5 years, but like I left
Oh
just because I
wow.
didn't want to be traveling so much with a little girl because I have a
Yeah.
young daughter. And so like it was it was a mix of looking at the data and going, okay, this is working well enough for day to day, but this is not going to push me where I want to go. With
Hmm.
two, okay, what can I do? What's within my, the realm of influence? What's within my realm of influence that I can actually take action to move to the next stage? And it became
Hmm.
clear that I needed to go somewhere where I would be pushed to grow by just putting myself in an uncomfortable environment. And I basically tried to pick the most aligned with what I wanted, but the hardest possible challenge that I could take.
Wow.
Because I knew, and connecting this all back to the personal stuff, I knew that long term, I wanted to be an entrepreneur and have my own things, my own businesses. Therefore, it's not about playing the short game. If I took 1, 3, 5 years, it ended up being 6, working for somebody else. As long as that was still within the path of, in this case, learnings that I wanted to develop myself to move to the next step, that's fine. Because, if we're talking about life goals, what's 5 years?
Yep. It's a drop in the bucket in your total span of your career. I think it takes a big, I don't know, a broader perspective, or really, honestly, kind of a mature view on things to say, after 10 years as an entrepreneur, I want to go and I want to learn from somebody else. So therefore, I want to be an employee, right? Because like a lot of the times I hear the reason why people move from employee to entrepreneur is because they just don't want to have a boss, or they feel like they're held back in their corporate environment. And there's elements of truth to that. I feel like I experienced that to some extent in my own transition. But for you to go entrepreneur to employee, in large part because of your desire for development and growth, man, that is long-term thinking right there.
But
And yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
but think of it from my perspective. I had never been an employee, so I knew those things that you're talking about just from reading about them, right?
Yeah.
And so I needed to develop the skill to operate in that environment where I have to be accountable to other people than my clients, right? Other people than customers, whether you're talking B2B or B2C. Like, obviously, they are the bosses of any business. But then you have the people within the business. And I needed to be sure that I could operate within that framework at various levels, so that I can actually effectively then build a business that has a more developed structure and all of that. And so, and that's why I'm saying it became clear that I could either take a huge risk and start, going after bigger projects and hiring people and building all and learning all of that at my own, like, painful expense. Or I could go, okay, well, I can pick somewhere where I'm going to enjoy what I'm doing, where I'm still going to learn all of those things, but I'm not going to be making the same mistakes because I'm not going to be in charge of those decisions. And so I can just learn from that. So in terms of cost of opportunity, it makes sense.
Yeah. There's a certain growth trajectory that comes in both entrepreneurship and being an employee, and they just have different curves. And at a certain point, it's more efficient to learn as an employee. And then in other circumstances, it's way more efficient to learn as an entrepreneur than as an employee. So it really just depends on where you are in your growth trajectory. And again, just kudos to you for recognizing where you needed the growth, and you knew that you could get there eventually as an entrepreneur, but you could bypass probably years of painful experience as an entrepreneur if you were just in an environment where you were learning from the best.
That's exactly
it. And so, I know it started off as more of like a concept for you when you took your full-time job as an employee. You kind of had started Penguin Objective on the side. Could you talk to us a little bit about what did that practically look like day to day to have this other business, Penguin Objective, really on the side while you're a full-time employee? How did that actually manifest for you?
So this manifests, I guess, to put properly into context. So when I left Web Summit and joined Kenko, where I went next, I went as head of engineering, and then after a few months into VP of engineering. So a much more strategic kind of role in both ways. But in that transition where I was trying to decide whether I should take a next role or go back on my own, I still thought I had more to go, but I knew that it wouldn't be a forever thing, that I would be building a corporate career. And so I wanted to take steps to at least start. I love the analogy, I heard this in a podcast, of to get the car moving and then you can turn it, right? If the car is stopped, there's no way you can adjust trajectory. And so at the time, I really wanted to at least incorporate the business because that would force me to start navigating taxes, accounting,
Mm-hmm.
basic operational stuff around the business, even if I wasn't doing any external work. And so it would give me an opportunity to make sure the basics were in place before I started focusing on the business 100%. But also, it gave me a little bit more pressure to actually start thinking about, okay, where do I want to go with this? And
Interesting.
so it took about a year, I think it was like a year and a half, a year, 3 months, something like that, until finally the voice at the back of my head was like too strong of like, why are you waking up and going
Mm-hmm.
and working on a different, and don't get me wrong, I love that business, great
Mm-hmm.
people, really, really cool mission, really cool product. They use the same process that NASA uses to dehydrate fruit and veg. Like it's really cool stuff. Yeah, yeah,
Whoa.
yeah. And they're in like Walmart and Target. And so like really cool
Huh.
business, really like I loved my experience there, but it just got to a point where it's like I need I need to be true to myself and go after that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't a case where I was like moonlighting client work or anything like that. It was a matter of like I'm very much a paper and pen person, and like when the day I incorporated the business, I bought a notebook just to think about the business, and so it was very much filling out that notebook with anything and everything from like how to think about positioning, what kind of actual
Mm-hmm.
do I want to do, a product or a service business, in which market, in which niche, like just really trying to get a plan in place because I knew the basics, right? I knew what I could do. I knew what my pillars are because they've been consistent in my career. It's strategy, operations, and tech. Like,
Yeah.
so I had a little bit of boundaries, but then I needed to figure out, okay, but what do I want to bring to the market? Where do I want to
Mm-hmm.
do that? Do I want to be marketing heavy, which I'm not? Or if not, then how am I going to get a pipeline of clients and all of that? So uh, thinking out my sales process, then that's when I started like researching inside sales for like enterprise B2B and picking up techniques from there because I don't focus on that market, but there's definitely stuff you can learn from
Mm-hmm.
like the best AEs out there. And so I
Yep.
literally started expanding my LinkedIn network in terms of learning from all the areas that I didn't know enough to try and
Mm-hmm.
start building out a little map of anything from like building a business model using the canvas, like the business model canvas from the book,
Mm-hmm.
to hashing out different versions of OKRs for the first couple of quarters and where
Interesting.
that would lead. Really thinking
Yeah.
about how do I want to go about this, and
Hmm.
eventually, when it felt like I had to move on, I did, and then I focused on it full time, and that's when I started actually going after clients. I didn't really have anything lined up the moment that I said to the CEO who I reported to, like, "Hey, I'm gonna leave. Like this, I need to do this now."
Hmm.
And then we have notice, so I gave my notice, and then took a month break, and then started generating pipeline and thinking about, okay, what am I going to do, and starting to
Hmm.
actually put asks. I didn't even have a website until like 6 months in, so it's been an
Oh
interesting journey.
wow. Which that's a whole topic in and of itself. But I think something you're talking about here is spending time. It was like a year and 3 months spending time thinking about and like putting pen to paper and before taking action, just kind of like gathering your thoughts and all that stuff. And I think a lot of times, rightfully so, in the entrepreneurial space, we want to encourage people to not do the overthinking, but the reason why that advice exists is because most people are overthinkers. Most people have always ever been an employee and they've never actually had the experience. But I think with your experience, you had 10 years as an entrepreneur and then you were an employee. And so, like, I think it's a different situation for you to have already been out there and doing the things to then take a season of being more contemplative, being more inward focused, and being more planning. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And clearly it's working for you with Penguin Objective. Or would you do it differently?
I think I would have pulled the trigger a little bit earlier, not a lot
Hmm.
earlier. I think the fact that I
Hmm.
really liked what I was doing kept me
Hmm.
on for longer than I would have otherwise. Like if I had taken a
Hmm.
job that I didn't like, I would have left earlier. Like I think that's the best way to
Way
put it.
earlier.
That being said, like I do think that it's dangerous to do the pen and paper exercise that I did because it's very, very easy to overthink and overdo it. And I for sure have fallen into that trap. I think the key difference is I'm only trying to answer one question, right? Which is which problem to solve
Hmm.
and how to solve it. So I only have to solve it once.
Hmm.
Those are my boundaries so that I don't go into a rabbit hole, right? It's what
Sure.
to look at, what is the focus, not the number one. No, if a friend of mine used to say, if there's multiple priorities, nothing's a priority, right? So it's
Hmm.
not figuring out number one priority, it's figuring out the priority, and
Hmm.
then understanding how deep you want to go into it and where your boundary
Oh,
is, right?
interesting.
What's your metric for Lean Startup style? I have a first edition of Lean Startup, so very, very much a fan.
Hmm.
It's like, what's the hypothesis that you're testing for that particular segment in
Hmm.
terms of like problem scope or um, problem space in that time? What's the hypothesis? What's the metric? What are you going to
Hmm.
test? And then literally just listening to the data, like just do the work. So I think the point I'm trying to make is overthink as much as you can, but set a boundary of here's the metric.
Hmm.
And then when you start acting on it, just be relentless on acting on it. Because the
Hmm.
more you put into it, the faster you're going to get to the metric, or the more quantity and quality you'll have, depending on whether it's time bound or not. And that will bring you to the best next decision. So so I guess what I'm trying to say,
Hmm.
I had never thought about this out loud. So what I'm trying to say is it's about figuring out what's the next challenge and
Hmm.
picking the right one to tackle at the moment to identify the next one. That's what I'm trying to say.
Hmm. That's really good. So what I'm hearing you say is you probably would have started if you were to do it over again. You probably would have pulled the trigger a little earlier, but not much earlier. So it's not like you had delayed too
No,
long.
no, just a few months.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. And I mean, it just goes to show you that, your time at Kenko, like they as a company were objectively, it was a good role. It was a good company. Otherwise you wouldn't have stayed for as long as you did.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I've been very, very fortunate in that regard. Like I only worked for two
Hmm.
different companies, and in both of them, I made friends. I had wonderful experiences. Like it was, I don't know if it was my intuition of filtering who I applied to and eventually signed. um, but I do think it's unusual for a lot of chatter that I see and conversations with friends, etc. That you come out of a role and you go, you know what? Like sure, there were some parts that could have done different or been better, but I don't hold a grudge. I don't have like there's. I look
Hmm.
back and I go, yeah, that was a good thing. That was a good thing to have in my
Hmm.
life. I think I've been very fortunate in that.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I love it. So, speaking about your experience, both as an entrepreneur for 10 years and then working for two different companies, you've had a good exposure to not only internally your own software team, but also working in these other companies. What would you say from your experience? What do you think most software dev agencies, or maybe even other software teams, often get wrong?
Looking too specifically too soon. So kind of connected to
Hmm.
what we were saying about the overthinking.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of tech-minded folks, whether they're actual software devs or not, but in those environments, look at sales as, aliens that are just trying to make a buck and like they don't know anything about it. Those are the most important conversations. It's figuring out like why
Hmm.
is someone paying for this? What is actually being
Hmm.
resolved for them? And then you can bring in all the strategy and the frameworks and all the agile and all of that, etc. So like for me, for example, setting up a team, I always start with Kanban. No questions.
Hmm.
It's Kanban and work in progress limits. Those are the two things that you need to start. Then eventually start with the definition of done. Then pick out what's the next right one. A definition of ready. Maybe you do want to add a sprint cycle because you're starting to get like a proper roadmap. Or maybe you want to keep everything in Kanban and just focus on feedback loops, which would be the way I would go about it. So key core DevOps principles of flow, feedback loops, continuous improvement. Like those are, people nowadays think of DevOps as like, infrastructure and tooling and all that. That's beside the point. That's just how to execute. Like it's all about those three things. How do things flow? How do we learn from it? How do we grow? And if people are immediately jumping to architecture or like feature design and all of those things, like if you reach out to an agency with an issue, they'll do a scope discovery.
Yeah.
Maybe have a solution engineer or a pre-sales engineer or something on the call, and then give you a proposal that has immediately a set of features. How many proposals like that have you seen that actually focus on, here's how we're going to learn if this is working. Here's the metrics for this feature. Or here's why we're going to push canary deployments for this, because we want to learn this and this and that. Or here's how we're going to embed customer feedback for product-led growth in it. These conversations tend to be detached between sales, marketing, and product. And so I think a lot of the agencies and teams are happy to stay in their bubble. And that for me is where they hit blockers, because then, and that's where you start to have like conflict, because people start getting too attached to solutions because they're just looking at the tech, and the tech is very important and a craft on its own, like no questions about it. But it does have to connect to the other layer of why did anyone even think we should do this? And this is obviously not in the context of developing for scientific and finding the truth about the world and all of that, but developing for business purposes, where at the end of the day, someone is writing a check to go, I want this done. It starts with the why. Like it has to start there. I think that's the most common pitfall, I'd say, for those teams.
Well, and I wonder if part of the reason why there is such an emphasis on solutioning to start with is because oftentimes, at least from what I've seen, dev agencies are pitching to non-technical teams or non-technical leaders. And so most of the time, those non-technical leaders don't know how to grapple with what you're talking about, which is really the emphasis needs to be on what are we doing to continuously learn, because we all know a requirements list at the beginning of a project, of a 12 or 18 month project, is not going to be the same requirements list at the end of the project. Like it's inevitable. Like a good product is going to require like updating your requirements as you go and you discover more things. And so I wonder if part of it is just a lack of experience on the buyers. And so as a result, software dev teams tend to kind of gravitate towards what their consumer is thinking they need rather than what they actually need.
And because it's easier, right? Like it's hard to have this conversation. So so what I'm focusing on right now is fractional CTO for pre-seed and seed stage level. So very early stage, usually working directly with founders, or if not, someone on the exec team. It's very often for me that I will need to have challenging conversations with them, right? But the way I look at it is that is actually my job. Like I'm if they only want code, great, hire a contractor, go and get someone that can execute on what you're saying. Do you have mockups? Can you do a UX test on like pen and paper and actually work someone through the full flow? Is it already defined enough that you can do that? Do you know how to look at that and then think of what you want to measure and how you want to build eventually your like data ecosystem and data pipelines to do business intelligence and all that? Like, a lot of this is about thinking strategy, right? Technical strategy, engineering strategy, workflow strategy, all those things. But if you're not willing to have those challenging conversations, then you're not doing your job correctly, in my opinion. And this may be too strong, but like I think maybe a better way to put it is that's the only way to add true value, rather than competing by price or competing by response time on your emails or whatever it may be. But I think that's a very, very neglected part because the typical technical person does not like social interaction that much. And so they prefer to kind of get a spec on a Jira card and go through that and let that part of the work be done by someone else, which is fine. Don't get me wrong. There's definitely a space for that. I block days on my calendar every week where I don't take any calls. I need to do deep work. I need to focus. That's absolutely a requirement, but it needs to be counterbalanced with the ecosystem.
Yep, 100%. Well, Tomé, I know we're coming up here now on time. You got a couple minutes left before you got a jet. There were a couple more questions I wanted to ask, but in light of that time, I think what this just means is we're going to have to do another episode because I think there's a lot more here for us to unpack. But if you wouldn't mind for us, something that I love to do for all of my guests on the show is I love for them to share with our audience some words of wisdom. And specifically, what I'd love for you to do is to speak to maybe two different people, or one or the other. So the first person is somebody who is likely a senior developer working in corporate America. They're thinking, man, I'd love to start my own thing at some point. Maybe they're even starting to make plans towards making that shift soon. So senior developer in corporate America, or the software development agency founder, somebody who just launched their thing within the last year, and they're still relatively fresh, relatively new in the space. What would be some words of wisdom that you would share with those people?
Okay, very different personas. For the developer, I would say, first and foremost, read the MUM test. It is the best possible book you can read at that stage, because you're going to have a ton of ideas, but they're only worth something once you actually start getting feedback on them, and unbiased feedback, actual data. And that book, I think, is a really, really great intro for engineer types on how to do that effectively. And it gives you a framework, it gives you a structure around it, which we like. So it's easy to follow. And don't overcomplicate. A proof of concept, as I said, is paper and pen workflows. If you want something more than that, it's a landing page. Go on card.co, pay the $5 or whatever it is a year or a month, I don't know, and build a landing page. That's all you need. You don't need a functional product. Once you get to the proof of concept, build one feature, the number one value. No user sign up, no user login, no passwords, no nothing. One page, here's the value. That's how you validate things and start there. For the agency parts, get really, really good at cash flow. Any freelancer out there will tell you, and agencies are, a more evolved version of that, will tell you feast and famine cycle is a thing. And for those unaware, it's basically sometimes you have months where it seems like nothing is landing, no proposal is getting accepted, you have zero pipeline, you're reaching out every possible way you can, and you're like, oh my God, why did I start a business? Been there, done that. It's frightening. And then suddenly something changes. You never know what, but all of a sudden, all of them, or most of them, come to you and you're overwhelmed with everybody saying yes. And suddenly you're like, I need to raise my rates because I can't do all of this. And so this is a cycle. As an agency owner, this is a cycle, but you have a much, much higher risk in terms of operational expenses, overhead. We're talking CapEx and OpEx, but we're also talking about marketing and sales that fit into that. Think about your cash flow. And what I mean by that is learn how to read the P&L, learn how to break your P&L apart depending on your business model, because a P&L for SaaS is different than a P&L for an agency.
Amen.
What is your metric? Are you looking at utilization rate? Are you looking at how are you measuring project success for the client internally in terms of strategic goals, and internally in terms of operations, day to day? How do those metrics look like? Because that's the life of your business. It's knowing where you are and how far you can go. The number one most important information for you to make decisions is is this the right thing to do? Number two is, can I do it without risking the rest of the business or the rest of the decisions that I've made? And at the end of the day, that comes down to, can I afford it? At least at an early stage. Eventually, it becomes much more complex than that, but the early stage, that would be my advice.
Yeah, well, especially in that first year. And, given the advice that you just gave, I'm going to venture a guess that people are going to be like, they're listening to this show and they're thinking, man, I'd love to talk with Tomé more. Are there good places for them to follow your story about what you're doing at Penguin Objective, or just like your learnings by yourself? Like, is there a good website? Is there Twitter? Is there LinkedIn, Facebook? Where can people go to find you?
Easiest way is reach out on LinkedIn. I'm very active on the platform, although I don't post, meaning if you DM me, you'll get an answer very quickly, and you'll see me commenting on things. But I'm by definition a private person, so I tend not to post a lot, only like every few months. And my website is IamTomé, IamTO.me. I think it's a nice play on words. You can also go through penguinobjective.me and it will redirect you. As I said, I don't even have a website for the business itself. I use my own as the core entry point. But yeah, I'm super willing to share and get advice and give advice. So if you have questions burning, fire away. I'm always happy to have those conversations, because it's the best and easiest way to learn is to teach. And so those conversations always open interesting angles.
You're speaking my language by saying that, Tomé. This is why, amongst other reasons, why I was super excited to have you on the show, because I think you, in every way, personify the growth mindset. So thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing a little bit more. I'm really excited to have you back on again. But I hope you have an awesome rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. And thank you again for the invitation. It's been a really, really interesting chat.
And thank you to our listeners. If you found value out of our podcast today, please share it with your friends and subscribe for future episodes. Also, don't forget to leave us a review, because it helps other people find us and hear inspiring stories like the one we heard today. If you are the founder of a software development agency, or you know somebody who is, and you'd like to share something exciting that you're up to with our audience, drop me a line at tony@equip.com. That's ACCQUIP.com.